Imagine living in a country where the price of everyday goods changes multiple times a day. You wake up in the morning, buy a loaf of bread for a reasonable price, but by evening, that same loaf costs twice as much. Your hard-earned money loses value before you even have a chance to spend it. This was the terrifying reality in Brazil during the early 1990s, when inflation spiraled out of control, reaching an almost unbelievable rate of 4,922% in a single year. For years, the Brazilian government had tried and failed to fix the economy. Inflation had become a monster that devoured everything in its path. Prices soared, wages became meaningless, and people were forced to spend their paychecks immediately, fearing their money would become worthless overnight. The country was trapped in a vicious cycle of economic despair. But then, something remarkable happened. A group of economists came up with a radical solution, one that seemed almost absurd at first. They introduced a currency that wasn't even real. Yes, you heard that right. A fake currency, one that never physically existed, but somehow it saved Brazil's economy. This is the story of how an illusion helped defeat one of the worst inflation crises in history. To understand the magnitude of Brazil's economic disaster, we need to look at what led to it. For decades, Brazil had struggled with economic instability. Government overspending, budget deficits, and excessive printing of money had caused inflation to rise steadily. By the late 1980s and early 90s, it was completely out of control. Imagine trying to run a business under these conditions. How do you set prices when they change every few hours? How do workers negotiate salaries when their pay loses value before the end of the month? It was chaos, and millions of Brazilians were suffering. The government attempted various plans to curb inflation, but they all failed. Some strategies involved freezing prices, introducing new currencies, and even cutting zeros off the existing currency. But none of these efforts worked because they didn't address the root cause of the problem. Inflation wasn't just a financial issue. It had become a psychological one. People no longer trusted the currency, and when trust is lost, no amount of policy changes can fix the problem overnight. This is where a team of economists, led by Finance Minister Fernando Henrique Cardoso, came up with an ingenious plan. Instead of directly replacing the failing currency, they introduced something called the Unit of Real Value, or URV. But what was the URV? It wasn't a new currency in the traditional sense. It was a virtual unit that had a stable value. And the idea was to get people accustomed to stability before introducing an actual replacement currency. Here's how it worked. While Brazil's real currency, the Cruzeiro real, continued to fluctuate wildly, prices and wages were gradually indexed to the URV. This meant that, even though people were still using the old currency for transactions, the real value of goods and services remained stable in terms of URV. The government kept the URV stable, preventing it from losing value. Over time, people started to trust this new unit, even though it wasn't something they could hold in their hands. Once the psychological shift was complete, the government made a bold move. They took the URV and transformed it into a real, tangible currency, the Brazilian real, or our dollars. Since people had already become familiar with stable prices in URV, the transition was smooth. Overnight, the old, unreliable currency was replaced, and inflation, which had been destroying the economy for years, suddenly plummeted. The results were astonishing. Inflation, which had been at thousands of percent, dropped to single digits. The economy stabilized, businesses regained confidence, and everyday Brazilians no longer had to live in fear of their money losing value. The success of the Real Plan was so profound that Fernando Henrique Cardoso rode the wave of economic stability all the way to the presidency. He was elected in 1994 and went on to serve 2 terms, shaping Brazil's economy for years to come. But the real lesson here is not just about a currency change. Brazil's story teaches us something deeper about economics and human behavior. Inflation isn't just about numbers, it's about trust. When people lose faith in their currency, the economy crumbles. But by shifting public perception first, Brazil's leaders were able to rebuild that trust, making real economic recovery possible. This strategy is still relevant today. Countries like Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and Argentina are facing their own battles with inflation. Could a similar psychological approach work for them? Could creating a stable virtual unit help rebuild trust in failing economies? Brazil's experience shows that sometimes the best solutions are not the most obvious ones. Instead of fighting inflation head-on, they outsmarted it. Instead of forcing change, they made people believe in stability first. And in the end, that belief became reality. So, what do you think? Could this method be applied to other struggling economies today? Let us know in the comments. And if you found this story fascinating, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to News Nexus. We bring you the most interesting stories from around the world. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.